Thanks, Jay. And I'm not sure how to follow that introduction. I'm going to say thank you. Incredible in a lot of ways. I was sitting here trying to figure out how to begin to frame this conversation. When I was here a month ago for the Eisenberg seminar, this was a series of lectures that, with a lecture that was part of a series of lectures that I gave last week at Rice University, the Camel lectures. And so I spent 3 days and at least one day, 12 hours, talking to folks. And so as I contemplated what I had left to say tonight, I came back and I called this Remembering Why We Matter. And it was brought home to me in a certain kind of way yesterday. So Jim and I don't know if Rebecca's here, but Jim and I and Rebecca and about 30 others gathered at the Carnegie Corporation. I had called a meeting to talk about slavery and its aftermath. In 2016, when I was still the president of the Mellon Foundation, I gathered a group of scholars and artists and museum heads and others to talk about the pending 2019 commemoration of the first 20 or so African peoples stolen and brought into colonial Jamestown. And I wanted us to think ahead. It happened to be the day before the 2016 presidential election. And it was on that particular Monday. And we were talking yesterday about the sense of optimism, even though we were looking ahead to 2019, the sense of optimism on that Monday and what that represented. And so we came back this time around, and the conversation had extended, because over last May, I cornered Jim and I cornered David Blight at Yale, and I said, hey guys, I got this brand new center at Michigan, and I had this project called Slavery and Its Aftermath, and I brought part of that from the Mellon Foundation with me, and you conscript it. That is, I need your help to think about how we actually extend this project. And that project, as some of you in this room have heard, has grown into not only talking about then slavery in its historical form, but slavery in its contemporary form, and how we began to address the 27 to 40 million people worldwide who are in some form of involuntary servitude at this moment, and that excludes the 9 million who are in prison. And so you begin to think about the scale, and this group, and Jim and David and I and Lou, Tabaka, and a whole host of others, including colleagues from across the ocean, both the Atlantic and the Pacific, have come together, and we are trying to see if we can address this issue. Now you think about it, there are 2,900 plus abolitionist organizations in the world operating right now. And you're trying to figure out in that cacophony, is there a way to get a signal that actually can point to a direction for change? And as we were sitting there yesterday, Jim and I were marking earlier this afternoon, one of our colleagues is a guy named Duncan Jepson. Duncan runs an organization called Liberty Shared. He is by training a lawyer and a banker. And he spent a number of years working in the finance industry. And he said it's actually his experience working in the finance industry and that has led him to now create this NGO trying to combat involuntary servitude around the world. And there's one point in this room where I guess historians, we looked at professional vocation, outnumbered everyone else in this gathering yesterday. Duncan turned to us and says, you know, we need historians. We need historians. And he went on to explain why. He says, in a world of risk, and he says in most corporate settings today, as a former lawyer, what they actually deal with is audits and risk. And the regulators come through and they actually do a risk matrix. And the fact that history is a way to actually establish the nature of the risk and to be able to show these patterns over time lead to then behavioral changes that wouldn't ordinarily occur. And so he came to us and said, we need historians. And there was this moment where our colleagues at Michigan State and University of Maryland got a Mellon grant to create one portal that connects to every other digital project on slavery that has been created over the last few decades. And they had this incredible, so suggestive graphic they were talking about. But Duncan and his team also had a contemporary map of all of the ways in which certain cities and towns across the world are themselves hubs for the transfer of humans. And then all of a sudden, our historian colleague says, you know, it'd be interesting to map the historical map on top of the contemporary map, and to see if some of these nodes are not just new nodes, but have been nodes engaged in certain kind of behavior for the better part of the last 500 to 700 years. And you again think, okay, maybe that's why we matter. And you begin to think, well, who are the we? Are the we then those historians who gathered in the room? Are the we the students who still aspire to earn a PhD, notwithstanding all the doomsayers who talk about the abysmal job market and what's not going to happen to them or happen for them? Are the we the faculty who sit in these roles at these institutions and other institutions trying to actually explain elements of the historical past and how it connects in some ways to a particular not only past but a present and even as we anticipate the future? Are the we those individuals who have strong attachments to this department and other kinds of departments like it? In the beginning, we began to actually sort of catalog the we. And we are reminded that there are a lot of us who sit in that sort of royal space of the royal we as we talk about history, why we matter. And I was reminded of this, and I told Jamie I was going to start with her. And so Jamie Hart, who you'll hear from tomorrow's, I had the pleasure of working with, we said 20 years ago now? Yeah. or so. But some of you have heard this story. Jamie, she didn't know this. I had to remind her that she changed my life in a certain kind of way. Because as a faculty member, you want your graduate students to actually be comfortable enough telling you what they think. And that's not always possible. But sometimes we have this foreboding kind of demeanor and posture, and not everyone is comfortable. Anyway, Jamie was sitting in my office one day, and we were talking, and she looked at me finally, and she says, you know, Earl, when I grow up, I want to be you. And I said to her, for 20 years I've held on to that image of her sitting on the other side saying she did not want to be me. And after a moment of, what's wrong with me? I looked and I said, so what do you mean? And she said, well, when I look at you, I don't think your life is in balance. You remember saying that? And he said, and I worry that if you're the model for what it means to be an academic historian, that I don't want that. I'm not even sure I aspire to even pieces of that. And so we talked about it. We talked about it, about what it meant to be me. Now, for a moment, though, there was a little defensiveness, I have to admit. And I mean, what do you mean? You don't see me on the weekend, and I'm driving an ugly green minivan around all of Michigan with my daughter in travel soccer, and I'm doing all these things away from the university. But it was a powerful way for us to understand that we who sit in professorial roles around this institution and around the country are being watched. People are taking note of not only what we say, but what we do. And when we began to talk about mentoring, it's not always the grand gestures that are being cataloged and recorded. Sometimes it's the subtle ways that we behave and we suggest about how to live in the world that matters deeply as we think about the changes that need to occur in graduate education. This is all the more important because the conversation that we are part of today is part of an ongoing national conversation. In the mid-1990s, Jody Nyquist, who was then an associate dean in the graduate school at the University of Washington, oversaw a project entitled Re-Envisioning the PhD. And there was a collection of institutions from around the country that would gather on almost at least twice a year to begin to think through some of these questions. How do we make sure that doctoral students are actually not only being exposed to the rigors of their disciplines, but also figuring out how it is to become public-facing? How do we make sure that doctoral students in a whole range of fields understand something about multidisciplinarity as well as interdisciplinarity? This is the mid-1990s. And we go on and begin to look at this with Jody and the team would go on to say, and how do we make sure that we're providing them then with other ways of thinking about careers beyond careers just in the academy? How do we initiate that conversation? And it was real. I can remember graduate students, literally when I was the dean of the graduate school, asking me to come to our offices after 6 o'clock. And why? Because they wanted to make sure that their head professor had left campus before they were seen coming to us or going over to what was then there was a special person for career planning and placement. Wanted to know that they would have opportunities to think about other ways of being in the world than being just a faculty member. And we talked about this and I thought, okay, this is deep. If you think through that they were so cautious and afraid. And if I fast forward 20 years, I dare say we probably still have some elements of that still on this campus. And certainly I know in other campuses around this country. The re-envisioning of a PhD was succeeded by the responsive PhD project, which came in then the late 90s and early 2000s. This one was headed by Bob Weisbach. Some of you know Bob because he was on the faculty here at the University of Michigan in English for more than 2 decades. He would go on to head the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation. And Bob would oversee this responsive PhD. And there's actually a book that Bob and colleagues, including myself, that we drafted and completed on reforms in graduate education that needed to occur. That picks up again some of the themes from re-envisioning the PhD to today's conversation about a vision for a 21st century humanities PhD. And so I provide that way of sort of reminding us that there is this context, and what we're talking about is not completely a new chapter. And in fact, in some ways, we've been working at this for the better part of the last 2 decades. In fits and starts, and Jim, I think, was in one of those conversations back in DC years ago when we were sitting there trying to convince an array of would-be partners that they should indeed partner with us. So that was one part of sort of setting this up, and I'll come back to Jamie in a second, but that was one part of sort of setting this up. But the second part was actually something that happened here, locally. As we also began to ask the question, if we're going to actually get to a new vision for a humanities PhD in the last years of the 20th century and the early years of the 21st century, then we needed to do something else. We had to go back to what it meant to mentor and to be mentored. Coming to graduate school, particularly if you're a first-generation student, means that you don't often know what questions to ask, let alone how to go about asking those questions. And to be honest, not every environment is safe to ask questions. I mean, I'll say in this room, I think we're being taped, but it's already on the record. I can remember actually at one point in time, as a dean of the graduate school, telling departments I was not going to suggest that students of color actually enroll in their departments because they had a horrible record. Wow. And I said, I'd rather them get a PhD at Yale and get a PhD than to go through our department here in the University of Michigan and never earn a PhD. And I said, I'm going to tell you about it. I'm not going to hide it. I mean, I want you to know why I am actually directing students to go elsewhere. Those are the conversations we talk about DEI that require honest and brutal sometimes confrontation, not only discussion. Because I can say at least 1 or 2 departments' cases, even the withdrawal of money was not enough of a motivation. And because it was, and here's academic governance and faculty governance. And so you realize as we begin to talk about mentoring, there's mentoring in the abstract, and then there's mentoring on the ground as is experienced by those who are coming in to environments that sometimes they perceive, even if they aren't really, but they perceive them as somewhat hostile based on the ways in which people say and do things over a period of time. And so at the graduate school in the late 90s and early 2000s, and it's still on the web, we produced a mentoring handbook. one for faculty and another one for students. It was a handbook that talked about being mentored in a diverse environment. What do faculty need to know? And what do students need to know? You think, as we imagine this moment in the time and history of this institution and elsewhere, sometimes it's actually useful to go back and look at what we tried to do in the past to understand what and how we succeeded and we failed. It starts then with sometimes being committed to admitting students and working with them and encouraging them, even when they may have a doubt. And so I told Tracy I was going to tell a story and bring her in here too. Story. I don't know if you remember this one time when you came to me and you said, "I'm not sure I want to finish this PhD thing." You remember? Yeah, you probably. And I remember we sat and we talked. And I remember saying to you, because for those of you who don't understand Tracy had gone to the University of Michigan as an undergrad, had been very active in a variety of social causes. Was the Reebok Young Leaders Award of some period while she was a graduate student here for her activities. But she was trying to figure out whether or not the work she was going to do actually was going to matter in the world. And whether a strictly academic focused PhD would allow her to have the impact. At least that's my memory, and she can correct me later. But as we talked about it, and I remember I said, look, I grew up in the South, and there are certain words that matter, and doctor does. And I remember saying to you, more people are going to answer your call as Dr. Matthews than Ms. Matthews. And so if you can hang in there, we're going to get you through. And you can be Dr. Matthews, and that may prove beneficial to all the work you want to do subsequently. And it's that piece of figuring out as we sort of think through how we structure, because we can look at all of the guidebooks and you can read through what we produced here at Michigan now 20 years ago on mentoring. But is that part of being able to actually sit and have and intervene in each other's lives that's important? And I offer these sort of textual elements to say part of that then requires us both individually and collectively to be comfortable with a certain level of experimentation. Now, I can imagine a whole range of experiments, but let me give you 2 or 3 examples of what I imagine. Because so, how many of you in this room have co-authored a piece with someone else? Okay, the vast majority. Could you ever imagine co-authoring a dissertation or overseeing the co-authored dissertation? And the answer is no, you can't. Why? Jeff said yes. Yeah, but here we talk about interdisciplinarity, and we talk about collaboration, and we talk about new models for discovery and dissemination. But yet, the most precious of all, we still believe is single author. And I remember I was sitting on an economics, looking at some economics dissertations when I was Dean of Rackham once, and I realized there were 3 people, they all worked together. They defended on a Friday, on a Monday they were submitting a paper together. The only time they ever wrote anything separately was when they were actually writing their dissertation. And I remember going, is this sort of an artifice? I mean, we created this thing where they had to show that they were an individual scholar. And yet when we keep talking about collaboration and the need for a whole new way of thinking about the delivery of scholarship, but yet we would recognize their co-authored article on Monday, but we couldn't imagine recognizing their co-authored dissertation on Friday. What does that mean? Are we being truthful? Or do we say there's a different value system on a Friday than a Monday? And if there's not, how do we begin to actually alter that value system? So that we can say that there are ways of knowing in the world, ways of actually making people understand how important those ideas are, and that sometimes, yeah, it should be that one individual whose name is on it. But we have ways of actually assessing who's done what. and we have ways of talking about it. Can we imagine this? Could Michigan pioneer? Would we find approval anywhere in our world for trying something as radically simple and straightforward as saying that collaboration actually should be recognized and rewarded at times, not just when you're a senior person and you've written your own individually authored book and now you can do whatever you want. But you can do it on the front end. Are we prepared? Those questions, I think, are questions that we should be thinking about. Similarly, as we think about reading the Humanities PhD in the 21st century, what does it really mean to be trained in the digital age? I spent the 5 years I was president of Mellon. I would go around to every university that I was encouraged to speak that had PhD programs. And I would ask students 2 or 3 questions. I'd say, one, how many of you allow your students to open their computers in your class? And I would get a show of hands. And sometimes people say, no, never in my class. And I say, so it means your space is the only space in the whole day where they are not digitally connected. Just think about it. And I said, that may be a pedagogical reason for doing so, but it should be a deep pedagogical reason for doing so, and not one that, in my view, is reactive. But I said, more than that, how many of you during your time are actually trained systematically for thinking about how to deliver, disseminate, and organize materials in a digital format? Does your equivalent of a CRLT session include that level of preparation as well? I said, because if you think about the arc of a career that's 20, 30, 40 years, there's going to be more of it rather than less, I would predict, and I think that's a safe prediction. And the fact that you haven't even been exposed to the rudimentary sort of tools is one thing. I said, but it's even more if you haven't been exposed to the pedagogical and psychological learning pieces that go with digital teaching. So how do we begin to make sure, as we're talking about remembering why we matter, is to make sure that we're doing it and using then everything that will equip us to explain this to successive generations of young people, and some older people, but certainly young people, who will expect that they're going to receive certain information in certain formats. Some of that will be in books, but others in digital formats, and how we actually begin to think through a graduate curriculum if we're actually going to embrace some of the change that we talk about. This is all the more important since more and more of us talk about being outward facing. And as we talk about the public humanities and the ways in which institutions like Michigan need to be more public facing, the challenge would require us then to actually think about how we present ourselves to those publics, how we move into those public spaces. My colleague Al Young has just written a book called On the Edge of the Ghetto. And there's a study, 10-year study of Ypsilanti, and where he spent time talking to men and women, mostly African American, almost exclusively African American, about their vision of the future. And as I joke with Al, I said, in some ways, reading the book, it's like they want to go back to the future, and it says reclaim some part of the industrial order, and hoping for the kinds of economic security that came with working in a Ford plant or a GM plant and all. If we're going to be outward facing, we have a job to make sure that we help people understand that that part of the world is not going to be reclaimed. And in fact, it's going to get worse. I mean, I've said in this room now probably more times than some of my colleagues want to even contemplate. You know, I do believe that McKinsey is directionally correct. The volumes may be wrong. McKinsey issued a report, and associates issued a report, some of you know, that said that somewhere between 400 million and 800 million folks are going to lose their jobs by 2030 due to automation. Somewhere between 39 and 54 million in the United States. Now, it may not hit those numbers, but no one is debating the direction. There's not right or left or center. Coming back to those Ypsilanti neighbors, but they are not only said they want to go back to the future. When asked about the University of Michigan, the word that came up more often than not was fear. They were afraid of the University of Michigan. They would come to work in its hospitals. They would come to be a patient in the hospitals. They may, under certain circumstances, go to a sporting event. But they could not imagine themselves being students on this campus. And some said even more than that. They couldn't even imagine walking on this campus because they thought they would be suspect. And so as we sit here and begin to think about what it is to be public facing, we don't have to go very far to begin to try to figure out what narratives that we need to actually construct, that our next door neighbors don't fear us. Because if we live in a place where our next door neighbor fears us, then we don't have community. And we won't look legit. And what we want to do in the public will always be suspect. And so we can design things for public-facing humanities, but if we haven't gone to the core elements and figure out a way to begin to engage people where they are on terms that they actually can appreciate, in a language they can comprehend, and in a style that is receivable, I fear it will be no more exercise. And as I said to folks in Jason, I came back and I said I'm on a 10-year lease and I'm counting down. And on my good days, I channel my inner Jimmy Carter. President Carter once said to me he had more years behind him than ahead of him. And so he was impatient. He wanted to let me know he was impatient, particularly on a particular day when I was telling him no. And so in that sense, as I think about this, I think we also channel our inner Jimmy Carters on some of these issues and try to figure out, can we be patient? Or do we need to move aggressively if we're going to claim this? This requires us to then think about the partners that we will seek. Who are those partners? The American Historical Association, Rackham, funders, other departments? Probably in some ways, to begin with, all of the above, right? We want to make sure that we're working with the professional association so what we do here and what we learn can be shared more broadly with other departments across the nation. Michigan exceptionalism probably should not be the banner that we promote in the next 10 to 15 years. It means then we need a graduate school that's also willing to take risks. That if I came to Rita and said, Rita, I want, as Associate Dean, I'm hoping you would sign off on this co-authored dissertation. Can we figure out a way to navigate the processes inside of the graduate school? My hope is the first answer is not no. And that the first answer is, well, we've never done it before. Let's see what's required. It is that kind of willingness to say that there's always an answer before no. And it could be yes. I used to argue as dean that we all should practice the art of a possible yes before we get to no. And it served me well for about 18, 19 years. But it also means then finding funders who are willing to experiment. The danger is we know around the world, more and more of the private foundations are moving away from funding higher education, generally speaking, graduate education particularly, and experiments in graduate education for certain. The Mellon Foundation is maybe one of the last standing force has moved away from higher education. And you sort of go down the list, and we can talk about this maybe later. So how do we begin to even identify to funders that what we want to do really does matter, and why we matter in making that case to a broader set of publics? And then other departments. I mean, certainly at the University of Michigan, because students are encouraged to not only have their particular focus areas in history, but their cognitive areas elsewhere. We will need and must appreciate how other disciplines and interdisciplinary units actually approach these issues too. So I'll go back and rewind the clock, and we'll sit down, and hopefully it's always the danger of having a talk, and particularly a series of talks after dinner in a room that's a little warm. I mean, I'm seeing people fanning. This reminds me of church in the South as a kid, and what I used to refer to as a church rock, where you go like this, and sometimes it's in rhythm and sometimes it's not. And so I don't know if we can turn the heat down at all, and maybe that time of the year. But the point here is to go back and say, one, we've been working at some of these issues for a while. We've had some victories. We probably haven't had enough. That it requires students who are comfortable enough to suggest what they think they need from us. It requires faculty willing to listen and to hear, not just to listen, but to hear. It requires an institution that's willing to experiment because it's already securing its own status. And so it's not worried about losing status somewhere else. And it requires all of us, as we're working through all of this, to remember we matter. We matter whether we're talking about slavery in the antebellum period or contemporary forms of slavery. Historians and what we do has a place at the table. It matters in the ways in which we organize ourselves, and it certainly matters in bringing back our former alums who are in all kinds of extraordinary roles around the country. Thank you.